Good morning, everyone. I am Marisela López Catebeque from the National Food and Nutrition Institute. Together with the International Sweeteners Association, we are introducing this webinar, Safety of Low, No-Calorie Sweeteners and their function in the handling of weight and diabetes. We hope that all this information is really useful to all the participants, and understanding that one of the diseases that is more prevalent in the countries is diabetes, also obesity. 10% of our population in Paraguay has diabetes currently. This entails serious issues in terms of public health, and we are introducing this webinar today with our great speakers who have the possibility of using the interpretation services that you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can change the language from English to Spanish, and the questions will be received and the speakers will respond to your questions at the end of the whole of the presentations that we have for today. We hope that this will be very helpful for you all. As you can see on the screen, you have the option of changing the language of this presentation, and you can also communicate through the chat if you have any technical issues. Considering the time that we have, I would like to start introducing our first speaker, Dr. Rebecca Lopez. She is an independent consultant in the areas of toxicology and the consulting agency in Mexico. She has worked with different organizations such as the FAO, and she belongs to several counseling boards to different food companies. She is doctor in science and technology of food, and she will discuss the use of LNCS in the adult and children populations and how to ensure the safety. The floor is yours, Dr. Rebecca. Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you who are listening to us from the other side of the world. I will take a minute to share the screen with all of you, and I would like you to confirm that you can see it properly. We're going to see my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind words. I'm going to be talking today about how to ensure that these food additives are safe in any stage of our lives. As it was mentioned before, this is a presentation that I have prepared on a personal basis, and these opinions that I reflect here do not represent the opinions of the organizers of these events. I have worked as an independent consultant for over 20 years. I have received the approval for the use of different ingredients for the food industry, and I belong to the scientific counseling board of many companies, and none of these organizations has had any influence in the information that I will present here today. The information that I will present here today is based on the general principle of the Food Codex, and I will be doing this presentation with the sponsor of this event, which is the ISA. I will be dealing with the different definitions because one of the main topics that we need to understand when we discuss this type of products is the definitions, because this really limits the scope on the way we can approach them, how we can understand them, how we can interpret all the science literature that is published around these products. I will be giving you a broad sort of overview of the way we assess this type of products in order to achieve an approval so that they can actually reach the table of our households at an international level and obviously at a local level. And finally, I will give you some conclusions. It is very important to understand that LNCS, these non-caloric or low in calorie sweeteners, are food additives. The definition in the Codex Alimentarius that has been broadly accepted, that is the document that really gives us the guidelines for all the regulations regarding the additives and the foods in many countries, and which is a reference document, talks about food additives. A food additive, according to this codex, is any substance that is not usually consumed as a food, and it's not used as a basic ingredient in the food, whether it has a nutritional value or not. So it's very important to highlight that these additives have a technological purpose. This definition might change from country to country by their users, but the concept at the end of the day is very similar. The technological function of the sweeteners is to provide a sweet flavor or to sweeten. That's the only thing they do. Now, when we add as a technological function, the sweetener, sweet flavor, what we could be doing is to move caloric sweeteners or sugars in order to obtain the same sweet flavor without the calories or the metabolic effects associated with the consumption of sugars. However, it is very important to understand that they have a technological purpose. That is to say, that these additives do not have any pharmacological function. And when the organizations provide us with, the regulatory bodies provide us their recommendations, they take into account that they do not have any impact, whether negative or positive, in the consumers. This is one of the questions that we receive very often, because it is often thought that we could use them, for instance, to control certain of the physiological issues that we connect with sickness, such as diabetes, or to lose weight, but this is not their purpose, and we cannot assess or interpret the science connected to this type of additives as a medicine that we can use to lose weight. Now, why do we relate these additives with this type of diseases? Well, obviously, because if they're used as tools in the framework of a diet where we reduce the consumption of sugars and other critical nutrients, it they can definitely serve as a tool, and specifically as a very useful tool that allows us to have access to sweet flavors without having to suffer the metabolic issues. So this is why it's so important that we are aware that these are additives, that they cannot be used as medicines, as drugs. When in some scientific publications we speak about the use of sweeteners in order to lose weight without inserting them within this framework of a broader strategy for weight loss, does not make much sense, and it's devoted of it's devoting it from their real meaning. But it's important to know that we can use them as a tool, and this does not mean that any person should that every person should think that these are just a tool to obtain the sweet flavor, but people should be, regardless of their use, keeping a diet as recommended by the health authorities of each country by consuming full whole grains and fruits, vegetables, and everything that we connect to good diet habits. But it's all very important that we need, when we assess this type of products, we assess all the adverse effects as well. This entails different biological results that might affect to different degrees our health and the well-being of the organisms. This might reflect different changes in the homeostatic balance. So what we're looking for is to find no adverse effects that is associated with the consumption of these sweeteners or this type of products in the doses that we assess. Now, we have to take into account that we cannot make any generalizations, even though the title of the presentation and the title of this webinar talks about the LNCS. The fact is that we cannot make a generalization. We always need to discuss each different uh, product, if different substance. You can see here two different sweeteners that have very different chemical structures. That this means that their physiological and biological characteristics are very different. So when we study a specific sweetener, whether it's sucralose or stevia or aspartame, we are only we can only use the information about that particular sweetener in order to get to a conclusion. It's also important to understand or to take into account the purity of these substance and the doses that we're using. Sometimes we are using extreme doses in these assessments in order to ensure that we have a broad margin of or a broad safety margin so that we can really accomplish a real useful recommendation regarding the safety. Also, we need to take into account the adverse effects, because sometimes we have in vitro studies that are somewhat useful so that we can understand certain mechanisms, but the truth is that they do not reflect the reality of consumption. Food additives, when they are assessed at a clinical level, must always have an exposure, an oral exposure, because we need them to go through the digestive system, and we need to assess how they are absorbed, how they are distributed, how they are metabolized, and how they are excreted. Obviously, when we get to the clinical assessment, we need to take into account other factors, such as the whole of the diet. Food additives have an assessment that is very different from the assessment that we carry out for other substances. In fact, the assessment for additives tends to be much more strict and conservative than that we use for other products such as drugs. Why? Because we need to take into account that food additive is present in the diet of the whole of the family throughout their lives, from the very early stages after breastfeeding until very late stages in the old age. And so when we are studying the safety of food additives, we cannot take into account only the dose, but also the time of exposure in order to ensure that the whole of the population group is protected. Obviously, if we think about the most vulnerable group, which is the one upon which we make our decisions regarding the established limits, we need to think, for instance, in this little toddler that has is past breastfeeding and that probably is being incorporated into the family diet habits and can be potentially exposed to any food additive throughout the rest of his or her life until the old age. So, in order to be able to approve certain additives, we need to take into account this daily exposure throughout the person's life. This means that they cannot, maybe they cannot be recommended for a daily use throughout our lives, but we can ensure that there's a safety in the consumption of this type of additives throughout the stages of the life that we are submitting to assessment. Also, it's important to take into account and split the regulatory toxicological assessment from the clinical considerations. The technological or the safety assessment for the approval includes the development of the technology so that we can ensure that the substances are pure enough, that they do not have include pollutants, and that we can have a pure substance that we can assess at very high doses in all the tests that we carry out, and that I will describe later, so that we can reach a point where we can really assess the absorption, the spread, the metabolization, and the excretion from the human body. In the case of the human beings, there are specific questions that we need to ask in a controlled clinical trial so that we can take into account certain events. In the case of sweeteners, we always study, for instance, homeostasis and its impact in the metabolization of sugars, because we know that a vulnerable subgroup that is highly exposed is the group of people who have diabetes. Once this is approved, or this is passed, we go to the clinical assessment stage. In this case, we need to assess or take into account the whole of the diet of the person, if they're taking the right amounts of grains, fruits, vegetables, and other different types of habits or lifestyles. At the clinical evidence, or the categorization of the clinical evidence, obviously take we would put this at the bottom. So it's very important to assess the safety assessment from the clinical assessment. As I said before, there are different molecules here. Each of them represents a different sweetener, and the only thing they have in common is that they taste sweet. They do not even have the same type of sweetening effect. How do we carry out this assessment? We go from the left to the right-hand side of the screen. We go from the very simple assessment, which are the in vitro tests. Many of these tests determine if there's any genetic damage that they cause, considering that genetic damages is very much linked to oncology, or the potential of causing cancer. Anything that can give us questionable results at this stage will not pass to the next level, because we know that these products will never be approved by any regulatory body. After this in vitro test, we always do this study of absorption, distribution, metabolization, and excretion at animal body levels, in order to determine which are the potential exposure routes, and determine if this substance could be accumulated. This is very important, because many times we are asked if these products can be accumulated throughout our lifespans, and the answer, we have it here. Any product that could be bioaccumulated is not a good candidate to be approved by the assessment bodies, so it will not pass this stage. Then we move on to the next stage, where we still use animals. We talk about the critical toxicity at a short term, chronic toxicity, uh, chronic toxicity. Normally, the combination of all the data that we have gathered before, the metabolic data, if there's any metabolites that we need to study, combined with this toxicity, the chronic toxicity study, give us an indication if the product, whether the product can cause cancer or not. If there's any suspicion that any product that we are submitting to this test could cause cancer, will never move to the next stage. It's very important to take into account the toxicity at a reproduction level, because we analyze this in different generations, and the data that we get from these different studies give us a clear information about the toxicity in different very important stages in the life of a person, for instance, during pregnancy or in the development of very young babies. At the end, we study the absorption, distribution, metabolization, and excretion in humans, so that we can determine that if what we have seen in animals can be also applied to humans. At this stage, we also ask the questions that could lead to further clinical evaluation or assessment. In many cases, there are studies that have been made about products that could reach the end of the digestive system, and then we need to study the effects on the microbiota. We always study the impact on the glucose metabolism in order to take into account people who have diabetes, with the main final goal. We can obtain a toxicity that doesn't cause a level of toxicity that doesn't involve any adverse effects, and we have to take into account the studies that apply to both humans and animals, and we take also into account the difference between those two organisms. So the ADI is defined as the estimated quantity of an additive expressed in milligrams per kilograms of body weight that can be ingested on a daily basis during the whole of a lifetime of a person without damaging human health, under the light of the toxicological research results available at the moment. We also take into account all the risk populations, which are the young or pregnant individuals. This does not take into account children specifically. It takes into account the most vulnerable populations. The ADI is not a limit, a very strict limit. It just has a very big margin of safety. It's just taken as a reference, as a benchmark, in order to establish the limits at a regulatory level. When we have all this, when this information arrives at Paraguay or any particular country, the regulatory agency at a national level analyzes all this data and compares it with the patterns of consumption within the country that might differ from what happens in other countries. And with this, the local authorities decide if they need further information, if they can approve the product, what would be the limits established for each type of application, always taking into account the local diet. So approval is always based in the best scientific evidence. It is not a final decision. Authorities are always reassessing any new scientific research and report and study. They take into account all the uncertainty and harmlessness factor, and we're always taking into account the children, adults, and most vulnerable populations. And the local agencies always adapt the figures on the limits according to the consumption at a national level. So to conclude, it's very important to notice that all the sweeteners that are approved in the market in Paraguay have been assessed by independent agencies, agencies that have their own systems or methodologies for assessments, like the Canadian agency, the harmlessness evaluation agency in New Zealand, and they all use their codex for assessing, and also with the joint committee of the FAO and the World Health Organization. All these are independent agencies that have attained similar conclusions regarding the safety of these additives. It's very important to take into account that additives do not have a physiological function, so we cannot declare any performance or efficiency. We only use them to achieve a sweet flavor that is similar to that offered by sugars. And the use of animal models is appropriate for the toxicological assessment. We do not use human beings for the safety assessment. At first stage, in the first stages, we always take into account exposure during the life of a time of a person, and we assess different substances so that we can have a greater number of technological tools, we can diversify the risk, and we can provide the consumer with products, with additives that can give the flavor that we're looking for. When we read a clinical trial, we need to extrapolate the doses to compatible levels with the real usage doses. Then we need to understand the biological plausibility of the effect substance by substance, and we also need to take into account the biological destination of each of the sweeteners. And we always need to know that all these substances have been assessed and the harmlessness of each of the products that are in the market today are backed by the authorities that have approved these sweeteners. And I would like to conclude with this quote that I love, that says, "Love and scandal are the best sweeteners for your tea." I really promote the healthy lifestyle as a basis, and then when we use this type of sweeteners, we need to be aware that all the authorities and our governments will have taken the appropriate measures to ensure the safety of these substances.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
I took three main
Was
things
taking
from your
notes.
presentation. First of
So
all, that
the
sweeteners have
currently
been duly
approved sweeteners
studied in order
have
to
been
verify their
tested and
toxicity
authorized
inside
so
the
that
human body,
they
and
are
they're a good tool
harmless. And as the doctor said,
together with
we
a
have
healthy
tools
diet
to
in order
reduce
to
the risks
limit.
of diseases. So, well, please, two announcements. Make your questions in the question and answers cases. The question and answer in the question and answer section, sorry. So, well, we can go on with the program, with the schedule. And now we have Constanza Miranda. She's a veterinarian at the University of Chile. And also in the INTA at the University of Chile. She's also a member of the EFSA. She's one of the scientific officers, and she also works at the Chilean Food Safety and Quality Agency at TIPIA. She will be talking about the chronic dietary exposure assessment on sweeteners in food consumed by the Chilean population. Thank you. So, Dr. Constanza Miranda, are you there? Yes, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really grateful for the ISA for your interest in our work and the dissemination of these results at an international level. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. So as you were saying, I'm going to talk about the results of the chronic dietary exposure assessment that we have performed at the TPA, the Chilean Food Safety and Quality Agency, on sweeteners in food consumed by the Chilean population. So I'm going to give you some background. In 2016 in Chile, a new law was passed for the labeling of food products. It was an update or an upgrading of a previous law, of an existing law. From then on, it was a requirement to put a label on the processed products were high sugar content and high calorie content was part of the characteristics of the products at the front of pack. So after this update of the law, the food industry had to adapt their formulation of the processed foods and to replace sugars with sweeteners, because otherwise they were required to put those labels front of pack, and they had to reduce the amount of sugar in those products. So the side effect after some years was that there was a high increase in the use of sweeteners in products for all the population. So not just the foods for target populations such as people with diabetes or people with obesity. No, in general, all foods, all processed foods had an increase in the sweetener content. So in 2019, the Ministry for Health in Chile, that is responsible for assessing the risk in these matters, expressed its concern for the abundant use of sweeteners. So they wondered whether the use of sweeteners was safe, since many products had changed their population, their formula, sorry. And they also wanted to know whether there was some population at risk and whether these sweeteners are still safe in their regulatory limits or bounds. So in 2019, the ministry asked Atipia to perform a risk assessment to evaluate whether the consumption of foods with sweeteners was at risk of going above the IDA, especially in children. The rationale was that Chile wanted to comply with the regulation. So there had to be risk analysis, and some people were responsible for the risk analysis in Atipia, and then there were some risk managers who had to make decisions to mitigate and control the risks. And then risk communication. So the decisions had to be based on science, and the MinCell asked Atipia to perform this risk analysis. And for that, Atipia accepted the tasks and created an ad hoc team, created or composed by a representative of the health ministry, another team in Atipia composed of a colleague and myself in charge of the dietary exposure team, and our partners for methodology, scientific methodology and risk assessment from the EFSA and the BFR, the German Institute for Risk Analysis. So together, we created and structured and performed this dietary exposure evaluation for sweeteners used in foods consumed by the Chilean population. So I'm going to talk about the experience. I'm going to talk about trust between these ministries, the collaboration, international collaboration that has resulted in this project, because we have collaborated with these two agencies in Europe. So what is a dietary exposure assessment? For those of you who may not be familiar with it, as the previous speaker said, basically when you need to assess the risks of a certain compound, you need to know how much of that compound is present in the diet, and at the same time, how much the person consumes in a normal diet. So it basically means that we can quantify the amount of that compound, the test compound, compound X, present in the diet, in the population, and the target population, through the consumption of all the foods that are included in a standard diet. So it's the sum of all the amounts of that compound that are present in all the foods consumed in a specific diet for a specific population. With those data, I, as a scientist or as a risk assessor, can have an overview of the behavior of the various segments of a population towards a compound. So this was the target of this risk assessment. We wanted to estimate the chronic dietary exposure of the Chilean population to 4 sweeteners present in the foods sampled in the surveillance plans for diet additives 2018 and 2019, and we wanted to compare it with the IBA. Sorry, yes, the ADI. And so we estimated the concentration of additives thanks to the results facilitated by the Health Ministry. They sampled 151 foods. We identified 36 categories of foods. The second element that we analyzed was the intake of food. And we took those results or those data from the survey of the Health Ministry. Chile has a national survey for food consumption with almost 5,000 people surveyed, people from 2 to 75 years of age. And the third data that we used was the body weight. We also took it from the ENCA, the survey. So we had all the necessary sources of information that we needed to organize the chronic dietary exposure assessment. This is the methodology that we used, that we decided to use for this assessment. We co-created or we co-decided it together with the EFSA and the BFR colleagues. As I was saying, they are ahead of us in these kind of initiatives and experiences, so we decided to learn from them. So they help us define the scenarios that we wanted to assess. These scenarios were estimated from the lowest exposure to the highest exposure, and we simulated the worst case scenarios. We also have medium case scenarios. So we assessed 4 sweeteners, acesulfame K, aspartame, stevioglycosides, and sucralose in 5 target populations that were available. Toddlers or infants less than 2 years, children from 3 to 9, teenagers from 10 to 17, adults from 18 to 64, and old adults from 65 to 75 years of age. And we defined 4 scenarios from less to more exposure with a tiered approach. We also defined for each scenario different consumption patterns and loyalty to a brand by using several parameters. For example, the median, the 95 percentile, and the main contributors to the exposure for each of the groups. At the same time, we also decided on how to treat the non-detected substances with an upper bound approach. So in our estimations, we wanted to make conservative estimations with a safety margin as big as possible. And we preferred to overestimate instead of the contrary, so that the margins, the safety margins, were even better. So after identifying or configuring the methodology, we did lots of mathematical and statistical calculations. Unlike this picture, with so many people doing their maths, it was just women in our team. And this was how we showed the results. As you can see in these plots, here we have represented the results for each of the sweeteners, and the horizontal red line represents the ADI for each sweetener, and the bars represent the 4 scenarios. Each of the bars represents the population groups, children and all through the old adults. Here in the plots, you can see that none of the sweeteners in any of the scenarios, in any of the population groups, is nowhere close to the ADI, sorry. So the percentage the highest bar was here in the scenario number 4, the worst case scenario for sucralose in the children under 2. Was the one that got closest to the ADI, but only 56% of the corresponding ADI. So the safety margin is quite big for all these sweeteners. So we're not even close to the ADI. So the categories foods that contributed the most to the ADI for sucralose. Let's focus on the sucralose because it was the most dangerous one, if you want. Were the powder juices, fantasy drinks, flavored milk, and yogurt. These 4 categories of foods are vastly consumed by children. They contributed the most to the ADI, not just because the concentration of the sweetener was very high, but also because these 4 categories of foods are vastly consumed by the Chilean population. So you remember that the exposure takes into account the concentration, the consumption, and the body weight. And yes, this is important because we have to note that they are vastly consumed by children between 2 and 9. This suggests a special consideration by the risk managers, because maybe or not, maybe they need to take actions to control or to manage the consumption of this type of foods by this population. As the previous speaker said, these assessments are chronic assessments. So it is estimated that through a lifetime, individuals can consume these amounts of additives every day. So we cannot reach conclusions just for children in this case. So the general conclusion is that there is a very low likelihood of going above the ADI of the 4 sweeteners in other populations and scenarios. So we can say that it is more or less safe for the Chilean population to use these sweeteners. This is a scientific opinion or a scientific output. It was given to the health ministry, which is the risk manager, and they used the scientific opinion to make decisions for the management of this type of foods. For example, they updated the regulation of the surveillance and control. They also used it to update the surveillance and control, the science-based surveillance and control programs. They also updated the intake recommendations of the healthy eating guidelines for the general population on recommendations for a healthy life. And finally, they also used it for the whole nation, because thanks to this, they can be proud of having a system where they can make decisions with robustness, and they use a science-based approach based on objectivity and transparency for our decision-making process, that increases the confidence among the Chilean population. If you're interested in knowing more about this risk analysis, you can download it here. And I want to thank all my colleagues who made this possible. Professor or Dr. Oliver Linder from the BFR, Dr. Alexandra Tord from the EFSA, my colleague Rodolfo Rivas from the Chilean Health Ministry, and Natalia Martinez and Gustavo Sotomayor from Atipia, who helped me with the calculations. Thank you. And this is my final message: the value of science in the decision-making process, because a risk analysis allows us to incorporate the scientific evidence variable in the regulatory process by adding some independence, objectivity, and transparency that are necessary for these decision-making processes. The value or the importance of the risk analysis with national data is critical for many countries, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, where we tend to use risk analysis with data performed by the Northern Hemisphere countries. It is fundamental for us to lead our own risk analysis in our region, as I have shown you, so that we can customize our regulations, but always using the Codex regulations, which are the basic standard. But we have to take into account the local elements so that we can really improve our regulations that are really customized. And I always include this message: a collaboration is always needed if we are to create synergies, if we are to create more capabilities in risk analysis for any project. especially those that have to do with scientific studies. We need to collaborate with those who knew the most. We created a synergy. We created an inter-ministry collaboration, the Agriculture Ministry and the Health Ministry. Within Chile, we could increase our confidence. We could facilitate the data that really were confidential. Thanks to this international collaboration with the EFSA and the BFR, we were able to use the risk analysis experiences and create our own version of data exposure by using the international standards and the recommendations by the scientific committees who know the most about it. This synergy that I want to share with you because it needs to be replicated and reproduced. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. We'll be having questions at the end of all the presentations. We wanted to really thank you for the data you have presented, because they're really specific for Chile, not just Latin America. And you have talked about the experience that you have used for those regulations. Thank you. So the questions will be taken at the end. So you can use the question and answer section to leave your questions. We will check them at the end of the session. So now we have Professor Alison Gallagher. She will be talking in English. So if you need interpretation into Spanish, please switch languages. You can switch languages at the bottom of the screen. So our last speaker is a nutritionist, and she is a member of the Nutritionists Association in Ireland and a chief editor of the Nutrition Society journal. She's a member of the Nietzsche Association in Ireland and a member of the Nutrition Committee of Food Health and Safety United Kingdom, a professor at the Ulster University in the UK that has performed this research. She is Professor Alison Gallagher, and she will be talking about low or no calorie sweeteners in obesity and diabetes. Does evidence support a useful role in public health? Dr. Gallagher, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides? Just to check. I think you can. Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also to the organisers for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. Just before starting, I thought it might be helpful just to share where I am in the world today, where I'm speaking to you from. So I work, as has been said, at Ulster University, which is in Northern Ireland. And I Googled this, and apparently I'm 6,000 miles away from Paraguay today. But Northern Ireland is one of 4 countries within the UK. And because of our close proximity to the Republic of Ireland, public health is often considered on an all-Ireland basis. And for anyone who hasn't had the opportunity to visit or spend time in Ireland, I'd highly recommend it. However, today is not about promoting tourism in Ireland, but instead I wanted to talk to you about the potential role of low-calorie sweeteners in obesity and diabetes. As has already been mentioned, in just a reminder of the prevalence of obesity and diabetes. So first, when we look at obesity, WHO estimates from 2016 estimate that the prevalence of obesity has now tripled in the last 40 years. And now we have almost 40% of adults worldwide being overweight and 13% are obese. If we look at the picture for diabetes, recent global estimates suggest that over 400 million people have diabetes. And similar to obesity, the prevalence of diabetes has been steadily increasing over the decades. World Obesity, bring together global data on obesity. This has already been touched on, but no matter what way you look at it, the prevalence of obesity and diabetes has increased over a relatively short period. At the top of this graph is data from Ireland, where I am, and that report was reported in 2021 that 1/3 of our adults are obese. That's in the green bars, and the prevalence of overweight and obesity in children is of growing concern within the UK and Ireland. The bottom panel is data from Paraguay, which I think was taken from a large population survey that World Obesity used, which was published in 2011, so a little bit of time ago. But what is striking is that the prevalence of overweight and obesity is not really significantly different from where we are here in the UK and in Ireland. So public health recommendations are evidence-based, as we know, and there is also now strong evidence that prolonged high intakes of sugars or free sugars, particularly in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, are associated with weight gain, with diabetes, and with other adverse health outcomes. And current recommendations vary, but they all have a focus on sugar reduction and also a focus on whole diet approaches for achieving these reductions. Just to put this in context, in the UK, where I am, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, or SACN, in 2015 recommended that the intake of free sugars be limited to less than 5% of total energy intake. However, data shown here in the middle of the screen from the UK National Diet and Nutrition Survey, this is a rolling population survey, it clearly shows that the UK population overconsumes free sugars. So the orange line here on the graph represents the 5% recommendation, and you'll see that for all age categories, they're overconsuming free sugars. And there's some children that are consuming over twice the recommended levels of sugar. So this is of real concern. Strategies, I suppose there are a number of strategies which different governments and agencies have taken to try and limit the intake of free sugars. This is out with this talk today. But as we've already heard from the previous speakers, in terms of sugar reduction, really low-calorie sweeteners have a role to play. They're used really to maintain sweetness and palatability of foods and beverages, but without the concomitant energy content that nutritive sweeteners such as free sugars would add. So it's really often through such replacements that consumers are provided with healthier alternatives, maybe products that have reduced free sugars or have done these sort of like sugar swaps where they put low-calorie sweeteners into the product in place of the nutritive sweeteners. That's easily done for beverages, a bit more tricky for foods. But do sweeteners have a role to play, I suppose, in limiting the intakes of free sugars? The answer in my mind to that question is yes, they do. But it is important to note that low-calorie sweeteners will never be a silver bullet. They are not the only solution for sugar reduction. Now, next, I want to quickly take you through the evidence in relation to sweeteners, in relation to body weight, weight management, and diabetes in particular. So first, just a reminder of this hierarchy of evidence pyramid, that many of you may be familiar with. So this is the evidence that we base recommendations on, that we look to the data and the evidence to determine what our recommendations and guidance arise from. And at the top of this, you'll see systematic reviews and meta-analysis of RCTs. And as we go down the pyramid, the quality of the evidence then becomes lower and the risk of bias increases. So just want you to bear that in mind as we go through the evidence. So what I'm going to do is take you on a whistle-stop tour, so a quick run through some of the evidence based on coming from systematic reviews and meta-analysis on low, no calorie sweeteners and energy intake and body weight, first of all. So if we look at the evidence on low-calorie sweeteners and energy intake and body weight, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis that was undertaken by Peter Rogers and colleagues, and it was published in 2016. And it looked at the evidence at that time of low-calorie sweetener consumption, energy intake, and body weight. I'm going to quickly go through the main forest plots, which is how these systematic reviews are presented. And anything to the left of the dotted line would favour low-calorie sweetener consumption and a decrease in body weight or in energy intake in this case. And this forest plot here that we see before us presents the individual and combined effects of 12 prospective cohort studies. So these are not RCTs, these are prospective cohort studies. And as you'll see, the overall finding in relation to these prospective cohort studies was that there was no change in BMI with the consumption of low-calorie sweeteners based on these prospective cohort studies that were included. Next, if we look then at short-term studies, they looked at these, and these were defined as an intervention of less than 1 day or less than 24 hours. And they indicated a lower energy intake with low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar preloads in adults and in children. But you'll see from the other diamonds that you see on the screen that there was no effect versus water or placebo. It's worth noting that in 83% of the included studies, low-calorie sweeteners were provided within a beverage. So I mentioned that before, that it's very easy to provide these things in beverages, a little bit more difficult in foods. They then looked at sustained interventions, which considered those where the exposure to the low-calorie sweetener was for more than 1 day. And whenever they considered body weight, which is what we're looking at here, it was for studies that were of a duration of more than 4 weeks. And overall, the balance of evidence in this case indicated that the use of low-calorie sweeteners in place of sugar in children and adults led to reduced energy intake and body weight, and possibly also when this was compared with water. Now, subsequently in 2020, a follow-up systematic review, a meta-analysis, considered more specific questions on the effects of low-calorie sweeteners on body weight, BMI, and energy intake. And this is again from Roger's group. Consistent with the primary intended use of low-calorie sweeteners, the results for both parallel groups and crossover studies showed that body weight, BMI, and energy intake were reduced by the consumption of low-calorie sweeteners compared to sugar. The authors also concluded in this study that consumption of low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar decreased body weight, and that it also did this by decreasing daily energy intake. So that's as shown at the bottom of the slide. So if we look then at the impact of low-calorie sweeteners on glucose control, and how they might be helpful perhaps in the treatment and management of diabetes and for those living with diabetes. These are recent systematic reviews and meta-analyses which have looked at the impact of low-calorie sweeteners on glucose control. So in terms of the first of these, this was a meta-analysis by Nickel in 2018, and it involved a meta-analysis of 29 randomized controlled trials. And in that, their findings were that acute low-calorie sweetener intake did not increase postprandial blood glucose levels, but that there was a gradual reduction similar to water. In the Lohner review, and again, a meta-analysis, this was of 9 RCTs, they found no statistically significant difference on body weight or on measures of glycemic control in people with diabetes. And finally, the study by Grayling et al., again in 2020, was a meta-analysis of 34 randomized controlled trials, and they also found no statistically significant effect on postprandial glycemia or on insulinemia, but they did note a small benefit in people with type 2 diabetes. So earlier this year, the WHO published an update, and this was an expansion of a systematic review that had been carried out by Toas et al., which was published previously in 2019. And this updated review informed the WHO NUGA draft guideline on the intake of non-sugar sweeteners for children and adults. So earlier this year, as I was saying, WHO published this updated review based on the Toas systematic review that was published in 2019. And this was also part of what informed the recent draft guidelines that WHO NUGA's draft guidelines on intakes of non-sugar sweeteners. And I'll come back to those later. But just in relation to this particular review, firstly, I'll just go through the findings of this. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm really just going to focus on adiposity, diabetes, and intakes of energy and sugar. And what you see on the screen is basically a summary of these findings. And just to highlight that the data was considered and summarized in 2 ways as you went through this report. So first, the data arising from RCTs is summarized on the left. And secondly, data generated from prospective cohort studies is summarized on the right. Okay, so if we just go through this. So first of all, for findings for adiposity. So this was based on 13 prospective studies, which assessed suggested that were assessed, and these suggested higher intakes. You see the little red arrows are for higher, green would be for lower or a benefit, and higher would be not as beneficial. So for the 13 prospective cohort studies that were assessed, these suggested that higher intakes of low-calorie sweeteners was associated with a small increase in BMI. But in contrast, when we look at the RCT studies, we have 32 RCTs that were included in the assessment, and for that assessment, higher intakes of low-calorie sweeteners appeared to result in a reduction in body weight. If we look then at findings for type 2 diabetes, data from the 3 prospective cohort studies suggested higher intakes of low-calorie sweeteners was associated with an increase in risk of high fasting glucose. But when we then look at the RCT findings, we see that there were no significant effects observed for any of the measures of glycemic control, and this was assessed in 21 RCTs. If we move then and look at energy and sugar intakes, 26 RCTs were included in the meta-analysis, and higher intakes of low-calorie sweeteners in that situation resulted in a reduction in total energy intake. And they also did some subgroup analysis, which was undertaken in 12 RCTs, and that indicated that energy intake was reduced with low-calorie sweeteners when they were used to replace sugars. And also just to note that there were no data available for prospective cohort analyses. So in summary, this expanded systematic review and meta-analysis indicated that low-calorie sweetener use in any manner resulted in reduced energy intake, lower body weight, and lower BMI when we looked at short-term randomized controlled trials. So that's the side that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. And that would really, I suppose, support the replacement of sugars by low-calorie sweeteners as an appropriate tool for a short-term weight loss diet, which would then give clinicians time and public health individuals time to educate the patient into a good long-term sustainable eating habits. As you see, lots of red coming up on the right-hand side, but as I would say is that these are from prospective cohort studies, but we'll come back to that. So what do diabetes-related organisations say? And again, these are based on evidence. So Diabetes UK, they advocate for the use of low-calorie sweeteners as part of a strategy for weight management in those living with diabetes. And the American Dietetic Association also advocate the use of low-calorie sweeteners as a means of reducing energy intake. A recent meta-analysis by McGlynn et al. In 2022 was used by the European Association for the Study of Diabetes to inform its nutrition guidelines. And again, you can see that they advocate for the use of low-calorie sweetened, it's in beverages, as a substitute for sugar-sweetened beverages. So I suppose that recognises where it's an easier swap perhaps to do in the diet. And they base these findings on the associated observations of reductions in body weight and cardiometabolic risk factors. It's also worth noting that in Europe, we have the European Food Safety Authority who approve health claims, and they have approved the following health claim, which is for a reduced postprandial glucose for low-calorie sweeteners. So I mentioned that earlier that this updated review informed the WHO's new draft guidelines on intakes of non-sugar sweeteners for children and adults. And the public consultation on that draft guidelines was opened in July and then closed again mid-August. Now, personally, as a public health nutritionist, I found the interpretation of the recommendations that WHO have arose at a little bit confusing, but I'll let you decide. I'm just going to first just again remind ourselves of the hierarchy of evidence pyramid with systematic reviews and meta-analysis at the top, followed by RCTs and then the prospective cohort studies. So next we'll consider the WHO draft guidelines, which were largely, as I read them, based on the observational studies, those prospective cohort studies, and they appear to have disregarded the evidence that arose from the RCTs that I've highlighted. So what did they say? Well, they concluded that the recommendation should be that non-sugar sweeteners or low-calorie sweeteners should not be used as a means of achieving weight control or reducing risk. of non-communicable diseases. Now, this is stated or deemed a conditional recommendation. So in these draft guidelines, the conditional recommendation are those for which the WHO guideline development group is uncertain that the desirable consequences of implementing the recommendation outweigh the undesirable consequences, or when anticipated benefits are small. And they state, as you go through their guidance or their draft guidance, that the rationale for this recommendation was stated that there was no evidence of longer term benefit on measures of body fatness. So as we go through, we see other pieces of information which give us an idea of how they arose or came to this particular recommendation. And in their observations on interpreting the evidence, they appear to have weighted these results of prospective cohort studies ahead of randomized controls trials. And in their interpretation, they state that the results from prospective cohort studies demonstrate how individuals consume low-calorie sweeteners in the real world versus RCTs, where consumption is carefully controlled. And this seems to go against the actual strength of an RCT, which aims to reduce confounding and to avoid reverse causality, which is often present or has the potential to be present in prospective cohort studies or observational studies. So in my view, this interpretation disregards the very strength of an RCT in that it is carefully controlled. Also, if we look then at remarks, again, a little bit confusing in some ways, in that they state that simply replacing free sugars with low-calorie sweeteners in a food or beverage, they then talk about the quality of the diet remains largely unaffected. And this is based on where the low-calorie sweetener is replacing sugar in what would otherwise be an unhealthy element of the diet. And they recommend that replacing free sugars with sources of naturally occurring sweetness, such as fruits. This would actually, I suppose, go against their own recommendations. And it's really at odds with their stated guidelines in relation to sugar reduction, because you would not really be wanting to replace sugar with more sugar, as in fruit sugar. Again, this is it's in contrast to maybe the findings of what the systematic review also suggested that we've just been through. So where does this leave us in relation to the role of low-calorie sweeteners in public health? Well, I suppose, as Rebecca has clearly explained in her presentation, all low-calorie sweeteners that are permitted for use have undergone very stringent safety testing. And as Constanza has highlighted, countries undertake assessments of low-calorie sweetener intakes across food products, and many will monitor the intakes of low-calorie sweeteners in their populations. And this is really to ensure that ADI that's been mentioned are not exceeded routinely. So that's all to do with safety. So I think we can be reassured that all of the sweeteners that are approved for use are safe. I think we also know that low-calorie sweeteners are very useful as part of sugar reduction strategies. They are simply not the only solution, but as part of a toolbox for solutions to reduce sugar reduction. They certainly have their place. I haven't had time in this presentation to share the very many examples of policies on sugar reduction, but one example might be sugar taxes, which have clearly shown approaches that have been taken in countries that have been implementing these sugar taxes. So for instance, in the UK, in the advance of that coming into to place, lots of companies were already reformulating products, looking at portion size, reducing sugar content, and also using low-calorie sweeteners. It's probably been more impressive in beverages, which is easy to do, but there's more that's also been done in some of the other food product categories. Now, evidence does suggest that when using low-calorie sweeteners, particularly when that is in place of sugar, we can have a positive benefit on weight management. And also there's evidence that there's possible benefits in those living with diabetes. And I think that's what I see as I go through those systematic reviews that I've taken you through this morning. But I think one of the things that we also have to acknowledge is that there are limitations to these studies that are included in these systematic reviews. And, if we are to have very long studies, they may be studies that will involve difficulties, and they'll be costly, they'll take a long time if you're looking for those the evidence from longer term studies. So RCTs conducted over a very prolonged period of time are difficult to undertake, and they themselves are problematic to undertake. But reverse causality can be reduced by conducting such highly controlled studies, such as RCTs, even though they would be difficult and costly to undertake. And finally, although we talk about low-calorie sweeteners as though this is one group, as has been explained, these are a group of compounds, all united by the fact that they provide sweetness without energy. But they are a wide group of compounds, and as such, they may act differently, and they're also present in different doses. And it means that whenever we come to compare studies, and we're looking at the actual compounds and any other activities that they may have or other metabolic effects, we need to take account of the dose that's being delivered, the type of low-calorie sweetener, and also the duration. And this means that whenever we look at systematic reviews, regardless of how many studies are involved or the quality of those studies, often we will see high homogeneity across the studies that are included in meta-analysis. And that's just something that is part and parcel of doing these types of studies. And it means that sometimes there can be difficulty then gain consensus on findings. So I think that's where I will end my talk. Thank you for your attention. I hope you've managed to follow, and I look forward to any questions when we move on to the Q&A session. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Professora, for your
So now we will take questions. We have quite a few questions after the presentations. There is a repeated question for Dr. Rebecca Lopez. It's about the studies on sweeteners in the microbiome. Sure. So we have several questions, but we could group them together, and we're talking about the changes in the microbiota with the use of sweeteners. Yes, of course, and I was saying it's important that we take into account that each sweetener has to be assessed independently. The most controversial studies are based on animal studies, and it's true that microbiota is a fashionable term, a fashionable topic, and we need to understand it better, but it's important to take into account that these studies are based on lower tract microbiota, so the colon. And we need to take into account the compounds independently. Some compounds don't even reach the colon. For example, aspartame is digested as a protein and then broken down in amino acids. The most controversial study was done on an animal population. We know that we cannot extrapolate those studies to the human population, and was done on saccharin. So this study reports that sweeteners in general have a harmful effect on microbiota. We cannot accept that conclusion. It's only for one sweetener. So as I was saying, each sweetener should be studied independently, but besides, there are many things that changes in microbiota. Traveling, stress, the composition of the diet will affect the microbiota. So when we change when we replace all sugars with sweeteners, the whole composition of micronutrients changes. So this will have an effect on animals and people. So we need to understand the clinical relevance. And for that, we need to study the meta-analysis shown by Dr. Gallagher, because the clinical studies in humans do not have the impact we can see in the microbiota studies in animals. So we cannot extrapolate it. It is true that microbiota is a hot topic, but none of the studies are clinically relevant in RCTs and in the meta-analysis described by, for example, Dr. Gallagher. Yes, thank you. Second question. Also for you, Dr. Rebecca Lopez, one of the participants wants to know whether you can repeat the explanation of the calculation of 110, because you rushed through that slide. Yes, when we calculate the ADI, we take into account the most toxicological endpoint, which is normally cancer. When we perform the risk analysis and toxicological evaluation, we give very high doses because we want to really elicit harmful effects in animals in the most relevant endpoint. We take the most relevant endpoint is carcinogenesis. There could be other effects and metabolites and blood pressure. The most relevant is taken. The most potentially dangerous endpoint. And for ADI, we take the previous doses, the one in which no harmful effect was observed. And then we divide it by a safety factor, which is normally 100, because we need to extrapolate in the interspecies differences. So from animal to human studies, if we divide it by 100 so that we can extrapolate it. The 10 means the difference between different human beings, the intra-species difference. Let's talk about caffeine, for example. If I were to ask you, who drinks coffee in the morning, who can have a double espresso in the evening and then sleep, probably some of the audience will raise their hands and say, I can. But then another part of the audience will say, I cannot drink coffee or chocolate or tea because then I won't sleep. This is the intra-species difference. We are all equal, but we have different metabolic characteristics. So that is the 10, the number 10 that we use as a difference, as a different criterion. So if the dose was 1,000, for example, ADI would be 100, which is 1,000 divided by 10. The NOAL divided by 10, taking into account diet exposure throughout your life, or even before you were born, in all your life stages, in extreme doses exposure. That is the ADI. Thank you. Now for Constanza, you talked about the front of package labeling and the experience of Chile. And since we're talking about safety of additives or sweeteners, why do you still put in the labels whether a specific product contains sweeteners? Thank you, Marisela, for the question. Well, to give you an upfront reply, why do we still use front of package labels saying that a certain product has sweeteners? Well, all food additives need to be present in the labels. That's compulsory, not just for sweeteners, for any additive, for any ingredient. Consumer needs to know the ingredients of the food they're eating, and sweeteners is one ingredient. But some countries have decided to put a special front of package label in order to make it more visible for the consumer, for the consumer to know specifically that the product contains sweeteners, but that depends on the country. Of course, ideally, that decision should be based on scientific evidence and adapted to the local context. For example, if for a certain country that, I don't know, has an extremely high consumption or intake of sweeteners, and with a population at risk of going over the ADI, well, in that case, every country is sovereign to decide or not whether to put a special label, but that has to do with the context. In general, I was looking at the questions. I was having a look at the questions and saw that Mexico has decided to put front of package labels with the presence of sweeteners. In some of the countries, sweeteners are just included in the normal label based on the regionally and the national context and the national intakes, the risks observed in those countries, etc. Thank you. Now we have a question for Professor Allison, Professor Gallagher. We know that many people struggle to maintain a healthy body weight. So to what extent can we expect sweeteners to affect their body weight in the long term?
I take from that question that that's how would we expect the sweeteners to help maintain body weight? Is that the question? Because I think, as I said in my presentation, the evidence, we don't have evidence from very long-term studies. So I think in the longer term, we couldn't definitely say. All we could say from the evidence is that to replace sugar with sweeteners in the shorter term, so I think the studies were up to 3 months, we've quite good evidence that that should have an impact on body weight, on energy intake. In the longer term, I don't think we have that evidence. And certainly when you start to look at prospective studies, the difficulties that I highlighted start to come into play. And there are also issues around measuring intakes even. And I know we've had a lot of information on assessment, but when you start to do that at a population level, we're using a lot of things to kind of maybe check that they're not exceeding an ADI, but to actually understand how much of sweeteners people are taking in the different types, that gets more tricky. What I would say, though, that in terms of body weight management, using sweeteners as part of your toolbox to help the person who is trying to maintain long-term weight loss, I think that can't be a bad thing. I don't think it would do any harm. And certainly if it is something that could easily be swapped out, if they're taking sugar-sweetened beverages and they could be replaced by a low-calorie sweetened alternative, I think that's a perfect place to start. It may not be the long-term solution. So I'm maybe sitting on the fence a little bit about long-term. but I don't see any harm, and I think if it helps, why not for that individual? I hope I've understood the question properly.
Yes, another question for Professor Gallagher. Is there a meta-analysis with stevia? Do you know of any meta-analysis that has studied stevia as a sweetener?
I don't. There are studies that had looked at stevia on its own, but not as part of a meta-analysis, because for a meta-analysis, you're looking for a number of studies where you bring all of those studies together. And I don't think I would need to double check. There may be some that have been included in those meta-analyses, but they're not of just stevia. So the work that I've shown you is really where they look at low calorie sweeteners, but they don't have specified one sweetener. So it could be any sweetener. It'll be back in I could go back to the studies. We could go back to the studies and look at what studies were included, but I'm not aware of a meta-analysis that's just on stevia. I just don't think there's enough to do it just on stevia. That's that I'm aware of. Maybe others are, but I'm not.
For Professor Gallagher again, can we talk about sweeteners that have fewer effects on the gastrointestinal level, such as, for example, flatulence, or, for example, polyalcohols that have those effects? Because we know that some sweeteners have harmful effects.
So these would be like gastrointestinal side effects. I have to say I have not come across that. I think that the effects that we have had in studies that we have undertaken. Sorry.
So we know that some polyalcohols,
polyalcohols.
Create flatulence. So do we know of any other sweeteners that do not have that harmful effect?
The ones that I have looked at myself are intense sweeteners rather than the polyols, which are more bulking agents. So I'm not so familiar. I would have to pass over to my colleagues for other similar ones. And I think that the reason that they would be causing flatulence would be because of the bulking element to them. That's my understanding. The ones that I am more familiar with would be intense sweeteners, which are actually provided in extremely small quantities. And as a result, we don't really see gastrointestinal side effects. What we do find in studies where we try to give these to volunteers is when we increase the dose, as a proportion of what the ADI would be, we find that the participants report that it's too sweet to take. It's quite unpleasant. So when you try to test single sweeteners or blends, sometimes what happens is the sweetness is actually unpleasant. And stevia itself, my understanding is that stevia, when it's at a certain concentration, is not pleasant. So often you see stevia in conjunction with sugar. So in some of the beverages, I'm not a food chemist, but sometimes you see that it's a sugar reduction rather than no sugar when there's stevia for that reason. It's just because of palatability. Apologies that I cannot answer about the bulk, the polyols.
But I can comment on this. Most polyols are big molecules, and yeah, they are used as volume agents. So they are used in higher doses. They are not absorbed. They get to the lower tract of the gastrointestinal system, and they are fermented, and some compounds are released. For example, short-chain fatty acids. They generate flatulence. That's why most polyols have high calorie contents. Erythritol is the smallest one, since it is very small molecule is absorbed in the higher gastrointestinal tract and is not fermented. It is absorbed as a protein. Sweetness, high intensity sweeteners at normal doses do not cause flatulence because they do not use this metabolic pathway. It is used as stevia is metabolized in the colon with the microbiota, but the doses are very, very low. People who are prone to flatulence, especially children who can have that ailment even at lower doses. And for those people, they should use sweeteners that are dissolved in water or born in water or erythritol. Thank you. That was clear. Thank you. And finally, the last question. Because I know the speakers didn't have much time. We know that the food industry are looking for alternatives. For example, allulose. So do you have evidence or ADI for this new type of sweeteners? Allulose is in the process of being approved. It's a very rare sugar with no calories. So in most countries, it is considered to be a type of sugar. But toxicity is being studied. The allulose studies in the United States have not yet established the ABI. It's in some countries, it has been approved as a rare sugar or a product that can be used based on good manufacturing practices. The monk fruit is also being evaluated in some countries. Monk fruit is a special case because the use of the or its presence as a fruit juice has well, I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Rebecca Lopez, Professor Alison Gallagher.
En nombre de la licenciada.
Also, in the name of Elsie Boylad, we thank you all for the information that you have given us, the results of the studies that are very helpful for us in order to keep finding new alternatives and generating new alternatives as well in order to update all the things that we already have at hand and providing alternatives to the companies so that we can keep on improving and in terms of public health, and also with the understanding that obesity and diabetes are current problems that denote other issues linked to other diseases, all connected to public health. So thank you for all your contributions here this morning. Also, we want to thank all the participants, and in particular, the Association of Sweeteners. Thank you for all your work, for organizing this webinar, and obviously for the three great women, the three great speakers that we have had with us today. Thank you also to all the people attending. And so thank you, Dr. Professor Constanza. We hope that we will have you with us again, even if it's in a virtual manner, but that is so valuable to us. Thank you very much.